Hey guys, welcome back to Checkerboard Chat, the official sports podcast of the Daily Beacon. I'm Blake Von Hagen. He's Will Backus. We're here to recap Tennessee's loss to South Carolina last week, mix in a little basketball talk with Tennessee's exhibition win over Tusculum last night, and then preview Tennessee's football game against Charlotte this weekend. Well, Tennessee against South Carolina last week, they're up 21-9, end up blowing that game, losing it 27-24. What are some takeaways you have from that one?
They really just kind of hurt themselves. They had a 21-9 lead in the third quarter, I believe, and then they get outscored 18-3 by South Carolina. It really seems as if they just stopped executing. Of course, it doesn't help that penalties really set them back in a bad way. I think they had 5 false starts. 4 of them came on 3rd and 5 or shorter, and then one of them really doomed them because they had 4th and 5 around South Carolina's midfield, and they had to go for it. And a false start gets called, and it's 4th and 10, and they don't convert, and that was pretty much what sealed the game. So they stopped, they kind of stopped executing, but penalties really set them back. In the defense, I don't really know what happened to the defense. They got off to a little bit of a hot start. Sacking Jake Bentley, they get that interception. Shai Tuttle pulls down a tip pass, and then, they allow over 200 yards rushing. Rico Dowdle, I think, goes for 140 yards himself, South Carolina's running back. So they really just kind of fell apart in the end.
Yeah, a lot of people have talked a lot about the offense, at the end of that game, not being able to come through. But for me, the biggest takeaway from that game is the defense. You give up 3 touchdown scoring drives in under 2 minutes. That's impressive, even if you're playing a video game. You as a defense, you can't let those kind of explosive plays happen. And Pruitt addressed that in the press conference after the game, and he said that this loss stings as a program, and I think that's the best way to put it for Tennessee. You have that momentum from the Auburn game. That was their previous SEC road game. They won that one, and then you go against a South Carolina team that's struggling. It's a perfect spot for Tennessee, but South Carolina pulls through in the end of that one, and Tennessee can't get it done.
It is kind of a big loss, not just because they had that lead and because, South Carolina was a beatable team, but now when you're looking to the postseason, if Tennessee had picked that game up, then they would just have to win 2 more games out of 4, and that's perfectly doable, but now they have to pretty much finish perfectly, and, that's pretty hard to do, especially since they have Kentucky coming up, who's currently a top 10 team. They're facing Georgia for the SEC East title this weekend, which if, you told me that at the beginning of the year, I would have called you crazy. And then they have to face a Missouri team who's always dangerous. Missouri seems to always put up a lot of points against Tennessee. So they've got that. And then they have Vanderbilt who, it's on the road, so you never know how that might go. So to close out with 3 wins, they're sitting at 3-5 now, is going to be a very tough challenge if, they're wanting to look ahead to the postseason.
Yeah, Charlotte's a nice opportunity to get that 4th win, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But that Kentucky game, this is looking ahead a little more, but Kentucky, they're going to be coming off that Georgia game. If they lose that game, that's going to be a really crushing loss for them, and that could end up being a good spot for Tennessee coming off a probable win over Charlotte, and then you get Kentucky. Neyland Stadium could be rocking for that one, and that would certainly be an optimistic spot for Tennessee to get to 5-5 at that point. But going back to the South Carolina game a little bit, what did you think about Jarrett Garantano in that game?
I think he had a good game. The offensive game plan didn't really have him throw it downfield a lot. They did a lot of check down, a lot of underneath flat routes, crossing routes, and that was because South Carolina was giving them a lot of man-to-man looks. So they tried to beat those, just getting their wide receivers in space and using speed. And I think they did that pretty effectively throughout, most of the game. Garantano looked fine coming off of injury. Again, I guess we didn't get a great sample size because he didn't really air it out a whole lot. His couple of passes downfield were good passes. They were just great defensive plays by South Carolina defensive backs to get the ball out, and a couple of them probably should have been caught. I think he looked pretty good coming off of injury. He had 207 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's a good mark to have against an SEC opponent, even if it is, one like South Carolina who had statistically, a not great defense. So I think he looked pretty good coming back. He still should be Tennessee's guy moving forwards. He'll probably have a big day against Charlotte, but he did a pretty good job.
Yeah, and we weren't even sure if he was going to play in that game. It was likely that he was going to play, but there was talk about Keller Christ possibly getting some reps there, and he's named a captain before the game, so you're thinking maybe Garantano's not going to be able to go after all, but he does, and I think considering that, he looked pretty good in that game. And overall, the offense, I think the offense looked good throughout. If you take the whole game, you look at it as a whole game sample size, I think the offense looked pretty good. They were able to move the ball pretty consistently against South Carolina, but again, the defense, you can't give up those big plays. The offense is having to go right back out on the field. You're giving up those plays so quick, those scoring drives, that you're really shooting yourself in the foot. And with the penalties and everything else, it was just, as Pruitt said, it's just that loss stings for Tennessee.
Yeah, again, it's big, and the defense definitely needs to fix themselves, especially, they're not facing a high-powered offense against Charlotte, ranked 117th in the nation. They're not facing a high-powered offense against Kentucky. It seems like they can barely get past 20 points a game, but they still find ways to win. But then you face Missouri, who's got a great running back, and I believe his name is Crockett. And then you've got Drew Lock, who a lot of people believe is an NFL quarterback, but he kind of struggles against SEC teams. But again, Missouri has, found a way to score a lot of points against Tennessee in the past. I think they beat them 55. They scored 55 against Tennessee last year, and it's pretty much about the same offense. They didn't lose a whole lot. So the defense is really going to have to pick it up in these next few weeks. Again, they're not facing high-powered offenses, but if they want to win these games, then they can't just rely on their offense, because their offense isn't the kind of offense that's going to be able to, keep up with a lot of offenses.
Yeah, so kind of looking ahead to the Charlotte game, that is a good opportunity for the defense, because Charlotte has an offense, like you said, they're struggling offensively. That's going to be very much a defensive battle, it appears on paper. Charlotte has a 18th best defense in the country, I think it is. Obviously, that's going against some inferior opponents. I don't think they haven't played a Power 5 team this season, and I think they've played one team with a winning record maybe. So that's a chance for Tennessee's offense to maybe get things going. Charlotte does have a linebacker who leads the country with interceptions. He's got 6 interceptions, and he was actually a converted wide receiver, so he's got good hands over the middle, and he's been the key to their defense this season.
Yeah, Charlotte, on paper, their defense presents a pretty tough matchup for Tennessee's offense. They allow just, I think, 87 rushing yards a game, and the rush game has been kind of a problem for Tennessee all year. They had a bounce-back game against South Carolina, but it still wasn't, a great performance. They got, just over 100 yards rushing total, which that was just their second time against an SEC opponent doing so. But they face, Charlotte's rush defense that allows just 80 yards a game, and the run has been shaky for them all year. And then they, Charlotte's offense, 117th in the nation. They're only putting up 22 points a game, and that is against inferior opponents. So if you look at the matchup between the offense, Tennessee's offense and Charlotte's defense, well, Tennessee's defense has a good opportunity against this weak Charlotte offense, who's really struggled to put up, any significant amount of points against, opponents that probably don't stack up too well. Their opponents have a total, their 4 wins coming against opponents with a total of 7-24 records. So their wins aren't that impressive, and then their losses, I believe most of their losses have been pretty big. So Tennessee's defense definitely has, they can have a bounce back game against Charlotte. Charlotte's run game isn't that great. They only have about 140 yards rushing per game, which is not, a great mark. Total yards, they barely eclipse 1,000. So Tennessee's run defense, after giving up to over 200 yards on the ground against South Carolina, will have a good chance to bounce back against Charlotte. We'll see, we'll see how they do. And then getting after the passer, they did a decent job against South Carolina, and the pass rush has kind of been one of those things that's always been almost there but not quite there. They've had a couple really good games, and then they would have games where they kind of regressed. So we can see how they'll do against a Charlotte offensive line who hasn't been great.
Yeah, and Charlotte's quarterback for this game is a transfer. I think he's from Oklahoma State, if I remember correctly. But he was actually not the starter to begin the season. Their starter went out, so he just made his first start of the season last week. So he'll be going again this week against Tennessee, and he's struggled in that game. And their offense, as you said, they've been struggling all season. So that should be a good opportunity for Tennessee. And then defensively, Charlotte looks pretty strong, but again against inferior opponents. So Tennessee will need to get this one, but Charlotte they're wanting to get to a bowl game right now, and the linebacker I mentioned earlier, he was talking at his press conference last week about how 2 seasons ago they're sitting at 4-4. They didn't make a bowl game, and that's something they want to do this season. Obviously, last year they had 1 win, so they're coming off a rough season, but they bounced back a little bit this year. I think they're under a first-year head coach, if I remember. I'm trying to remember a lot of different things, but I just kind of glanced at these things a little while ago.
Yeah, they have not had a winning season, but they've only been a football team since 2013. They were in the FCS for the first 2 years of their conception. Now they're in their third year in the FBS, so they're still trying to figure things out, because when you've only had a football program for around 5 years, it's kind of hard to hit the ground running. So a 4-4 mark for them at this point in the season, especially after 1-11 last year, is great for them, and that might be a momentum booster for them. The fact that they have this motivation to get to a bowl game, they've got a Tennessee team who still kind of has a lot of question marks in terms of offensive line play, defensive play. So they could be feeling a little bit confident. We'll see if that's enough to get them past Tennessee, because they haven't faced a team like this year, and they've struggled against teams that you could argue are a lot more inferior to Tennessee. Being an SEC team, having the talent that they do. So we'll just have to see how Charlotte performs. Tennessee's players might be a little unmotivated after suffering that heartbreaking loss against South Carolina. The players said that it was tough too. A lot of them said it was going to be a hard one to get past, just because of the nature of the game, and how it kind of came down to the last minute. And so if Charlotte is fired up and Tennessee is a little unmotivated, we'll see how that plays out. Plus, it's a game against a Conference USA opponent coming in the middle of an SEC schedule. Pruitt said yesterday that if any players are looking ahead, then their head isn't in the right place at all. But it's kind of hard not to look ahead whenever you're playing a team like this in the middle of a conference schedule.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what the crowd looks like for this game at Neyland Stadium, because, again, it's Charlotte. It is homecoming, so Tennessee has that going for them. But it's also on a Saturday where this is probably the best Saturday of college football so far this season. You've got Georgia, Kentucky game, obviously, for the East. You got Florida, Missouri, Penn State, Michigan, all those games at the same time as the Tennessee game, which is at 4 o'clock. So I'm interested to see what the crowd's looking like. I'm going to guess around 85,000 for this one. We'll see if Tennessee can ride that wave of the crowd noise, because we've seen in the past Tennessee has been able to use that crowd to their advantage. And obviously, Charlotte's an inferior opponent, but the crowd could still be a factor in this game, and something that Tennessee wants to utilize if they can.
Yeah, it definitely won't be a sellout, and I don't believe Tennessee has had a sellout so far this year, not even against Florida. They came close, but so there may not be a great crowd, but it's not a noon kickoff, so they've got that to be thankful for. It's at 4 p.m., so people should come and be ready to cheer, especially since it is homecoming. Homecoming games tend to sell out a little bit more just because of the tradition there. So we'll see how the crowd, how big of a crowd there is, and how the team responds. Neyland is typically loud for games, and Charlotte probably hasn't faced a crowd of more than, I'd guess, 50,000 so far this year. I can't imagine, and that's probably stretching it too. So we'll again see how they respond to just entering first such a large stadium that has a capacity of 102,000, and even a crowd of 80, maybe even 70,000. That's a little bit on probably the low end. They'll definitely probably have more than 70,000. But we'll see how Charlotte does against just such a large crowd and such a big stage.
Yeah, their players mentioned that at their press conference this week. They mentioned that this is something they grew up dreaming about, is playing in a place like Neyland Stadium, one of the top atmospheres in college football. So they're excited to go in. But obviously, you've seen players come in have a lot of nerves early in the game at Neyland Stadium, especially when it's these smaller schools. But we came out with our pick'ems today in the paper. I'm leading pick'ems, if you forgot. I think you're in last.
Last place.
Yeah.
That's what happens when our boss auto picks 2 weeks in a row for me.
That's what happens when you forget to place your picks.
Fair.
But what was your prediction for the Tennessee-Charlotte game?
I picked 24-10, Tennessee, obviously. I just feel like it's kind of one of those games. It feels a little bit like last year's homecoming game where or not last year's, a couple years ago when they played North Texas and it was 24-0. It kind of feels like one of those. And I think that Tennessee will definitely win. I don't think that it'll feel like a close game, but I feel like Tennessee might struggle a little bit against Charlotte's defense just because, they're ranked so highly, and that's probably not a fluke even though they played such weak opponents. And I think, it'll be kind of one of those battles of good versus bad. You got a pretty good Tennessee offense against, or a pretty not great Tennessee offense against a good Charlotte defense, and then pretty not great Charlotte offense against a pretty decent Tennessee defense. at least at times of the season. So it'll be kind of one of those push and pull games, but Tennessee, obviously, with the superior talent and being at home and probably superior coaching, will definitely win.
I think their defense is kind of a fluke at this point in the season. They haven't really played anybody, and if you put Tennessee's offense in Conference USA, they're probably the best offense in the conference. So I'm going to go 38-13 Tennessee. I think they put some points on the board, maybe a special teams touchdown in there. It's just a chance for Tennessee to show off, their athletes compared to what Charlotte has. And you see these homecoming games, they get out of hand a lot of times. Although Tennessee has struggled in the past against some teams, Ohio and last year's Southern Miss was, not a blowout. Until the end of the game, and then
This year,
UMass, UTEP. Tennessee has struggled the last few seasons with these smaller schools, but I think this will be a chance for Tennessee to kind of boost their momentum going into these last few SEC games. So as we kind of wrap this thing up, talk a little bit about the basketball game last night. Tennessee with their exhibition game against Tusculum, obviously a Division II school, so Tennessee was heavily favored in that game, even though there was no Vegas line for that game. They would have been probably a 50-point favorite. Tusculum lost to Arkansas by 49 on Friday. And then they come in last night. Tennessee takes that one 87-48, I think was the final. So Rick Barnes not happy with it. We've seen Rick Barnes. He has high standards for his team, and even though they blew out Tusculum, he wasn't happy with how they came out in the second half. They're up 42-14 at halftime. Second half come out pretty sloppy. They had 16 turnovers in the game, something he's not happy with. So, we'll see what Tennessee does going forward. The season opener is on Tuesday against Lenoir-Rhyne, which is where Rick Barnes went. So we'll see what Tennessee does in that one. But last night, did you watch the game last night?
I watched part of it.
Yeah. So, Tennessee kind of, they showed that they're a better team. I don't know if they showed that they were a top 10 team last night. Barnes wasn't happy with what they did, but you have Lamonte Turner, who has 0 points. He's shut out in that game. That's something that can't happen going forward for Tennessee, even though they do have depth. That was one thing Rick Barnes mentioned he wanted to see from his team is how the bench performs when they come in the game. Guys like Yves Pons, guys like John Fulkerson, guys like Derek Walker. DJ Burns came in, the freshman. He came in near the end of the game, made some nice plays. Pons had a block where his head skimmed the bottom of the backboard. And after the game, Derek Walker said, that's not surprising to him. He does that kind of stuff all the time. So that is pretty incredible to see. Sometimes you forget when you watch these guys in warm-ups, but then when you see that and you just think about how incredible that is to get your head at the bottom of the backboard. Can you get your head on the bottom of the backboard?
No.
Okay, I didn't think so. So, yeah, we'll see what Tennessee does going forward. Not a whole lot to take away from that game. Tusculum, their point guard, a guy named Donovan Donaldson, he was an all-district guy, the district MVP at Hillsborough High School in Nashville his senior season. This is his senior season in college. He's their best player. He averaged 14 a game last season, so that was a decent little matchup for Tennessee, who's shuffling around the point guard position. You got Jordan Bowden and Jordan Bone splitting reps there with Lamonte Turner, who didn't get a ton of playing time. Barnes wasn't really happy with how he played, but those guys had a chance to play against a point guard that, even though he's from a D2 school, he's still a pretty good athlete, and they held him to 2 of 5 shooting. He only had 6 points, I think, in the game, so Tennessee looked pretty good overall. Grant Williams only had 3 rebounds, which was something that Barnes was not pleased with. He thinks Williams should be a double-digit rebounder, so that'll be something that he'll need to work on going forward. Barnes said that looking forward, if Williams wants to play in the NBA, they're going to be looking at his rebounding first and foremost because of the position he plays and because of his size. He'll need to be able to rebound. So, kind of rambled on there a little bit about the game, but those are some takeaways. And you have anything to add on that?
Just a little bit. I think you'd struggle to find Rick Barnes happy pretty much after any performance. Yeah. Even if they beat Kentucky by 40 points, he'd still find some stuff to be angry about. That's just how Rick Barnes is. It's not a knock on him. But I'd imagine that Tennessee probably, you could argue that they probably didn't come out playing 100% just because it is an exhibition game and the season opener is so close. They probably didn't want to give Tusculum, too many looks. And at the same time, the players probably didn't want to give, all of their effort just because it is an exhibition, it is a Division II school that, you can probably cruise to victory against. So we'll see in their season opener how they do in, an actual game time scenario. Well, that's not just an exhibition that actually counts on your record. So I think it might have been just kind of, their air quotes lackluster performance might have been a little bit just because it was an exhibition. They might have been looking ahead to the season, which is soon. But they're definitely probably going to be a very fun team to watch. Top 10 highest expectations they've had in a really long time. So we'll see how they live up to those.
Yeah, one last thing to add on that. You mentioned Barnes not being happy. He actually comes into the press conference and he looks at Grant Ramey, who's on the front row, a reporter for 247. He says, Grant, what do you got for me? And Grant says, what are you upset about today? And then he goes on. That's how the press conference starts. So that's just kind of sums up what Barnes is all about. But that's it for this week. We'll be back next week to talk about the Charlotte game. I think we'll have our basketball beat writers on. Will be covering Lady Vols this year. I'll be on men's basketball. I'll have Corey Standing with me. He'll have Noah Taylor. So we'll probably have those guys on our next episode of Checkerboard Chat to discuss the soccer team who's heading to the NCAA tournament and then to preview the basketball season. But for now, thanks for watching.